The role of parents in all this story is extremely important. The father of Augustus St. Gaudens, the immigrant shoemaker, wrote a marvelous letter about finding yourself in work, and that in work you could give the best that was in you, not to just your country, but to your God. A very powerful letter written by a shoemaker. I think in many ways one of the most amazing stories is George Healey, who was a street kid from Boston, Irish street kid from Boston, who went off to Paris. And I want to read you something that he wrote about that, because I think it sums up a lot of what could be said for all of them. He said, in those far-off days, there were no art schools in America, no drawing classes, no collection of fine plaster casts, and very few picture exhibitions. I knew no one in France. I was utterly ignorant of the language. I did not know what I should do when once there. But I was not yet 21, and I had a great stock of courage and of inexperience, which is sometimes a big help, and a strong desire to be my very best. That's why they went. What did they bring back? Charles Sumner brought back the realization after watching the other students one day at a big lecture hall at the Sorbonne that the French treated the black students just like they treated everybody else. And the black students dressed like everybody else. And they acted like everybody else. And that they had the same ambitions as everybody else. And he had never shown the slightest sympathy for the slaves he'd seen working in the fields out of his train window on a ride through Maryland to Washington. And all of a sudden he had this epiphany, which he writes about in his journal. This is something that later day biographers or historians have made up about it or imposed on it. It's right there in his journal. That he wrote that same night. He said, after watching these students, he said, I began to wonder if how we treat black people at home has to do with what we've been taught and is not part of the natural order of things, unquote. He came home determined to do something about it, got into politics, got elected to the United States Senate when he was still in his early 40s, and became the most powerful voice for abolition in the country, to the point that it nearly cost him his life when he was attacked from behind by a Southern congressman named Preston Brooks, who with a heavy gutta percha walking stick very nearly beat him to death. A horrible incident that took place on the floor of the United States Senate, the old Senate. You still go and see exactly the same desk and where it happened. And he never really recovered from it, psychologically or physically. Today in the public garden in Boston, there's a statue, wonderful statue of Charles Sumner, and the statue just says Sumner. I doubt that there's a person in 1,000, a Bostonian in 1,000, who has any idea who he was. When he died in 1874, his body lay in state in the State House on Beacon Hill in Boston, and then was taken 5 miles out of town to Mount Auburn Cemetery. The whole city shut down in honor of the occasion, and from the State House all the way to Mount Auburn, the 5 miles, was lined with crowds all the way on both sides of the road. And today, nobody knows who he was. That's why we've got to work on how we teach history, the books we read about history, why we should support institutions of this kind who are making a difference in what we know about who we are and what we owe to those who made possible the way we live. Healey, this Irish boy who went to Paris to study painting with, as he said, no knowledge of the language, knowing no one, and having no money, he became a portrait painter. There are now 7 of his portraits hanging in the White House, including one of the greatest portraits ever done of Abraham Lincoln. There are 17 of his portraits in the National Portrait Gallery. Like Augustus St. Gaudens with his great works at the Shaw Memorial about the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, or his magnificent equestrian statue of General Sherman and the Goddess of Victory, which stands right by the Plaza Hotel at 59th and 5th Avenue, near the entrance to Central Park. And like many of the paintings of John Singer Sargent, they were recording history in their way, not just as writers or historians, but as painters and sculptors, which is an important part of how history is recorded, because for one thing, it tells us who mattered to those people. Why would they spend the money to create this magnificent work of art in tribute to General Sherman and the victory of the Civil War? Or the other great St. Gaudens, which is down in Madison Square, of Admiral Farragut. These are American masterpieces, make no mistake. And both the Farragut statue and the equestrian statue of Sherman, if you could lift them up and turn them over, underneath would say, made in Paris. They were done in Paris. One more side note, Mary Cassatt had a friend named Havemeyer, Mrs. Havemeyer, who was the wife of a sugar baron. And Mrs. Havemeyer got interested in the Impressionists because of Mary Cassatt, who advised her on which paintings to take seriously, which artists to take seriously. And she began buying Renoir, Monet, Manet, you name it, in quantity. They were very inexpensive at the time. And that now is the great Havemeyer collection at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. One of the greatest of all treasures in our country. Now, as everybody knows, I dearly love Pittsburgh. And I welcomed, as any good Pittsburgher would, any time one of these characters came on stage who came from Pittsburgh. And at the very end of the book, I mentioned that Augustus St. Gaudens' only child, Homer, became the director of the Carnegie Museum of Art. And he was the director of the Carnegie Museum at the time I was in high school and very interested in becoming a painter and spending an awful lot of time down at the museum looking at paintings. So in theory, and how I wish it were true, I could have known him. And I could have asked him to tell me about your father, because I'm going to write about him one day. St. Gaudens, in many ways, is one of the most interesting Americans I've ever come to know. And believe me, you come to know these people when you work on it for 4 years or more in a way that you've known no one else. In many ways, you come to know them more intimately, closer, and you understand them better than you know or understand people in your own real life, which is part of the excitement of the work. Now, I want to show you some images very quickly of what I've been talking about. And if you could dim those overhead lights, please. This is the Rue de Rivoli. You're looking at the Louvre on the right in the distance, and behind that fence on the right is the Garden of the Tuileries, and the shops under the arcade to the left. Now, if you could take away those carriages and horses and replace them with automobiles, it would look exactly the same today. But I must tell you a little story about that image. That photograph was taken about 1900 and was used as a postcard. And the postcard was brought back from Paris by my mother in 1907 when she was age 7. She went on a trip to Europe with her parents. And that postcard was in our attic. And it's in miraculous condition, and it's, as you can see, very sharp. It forms the end paper of the beginning of the book, and there's another similar photograph looking up the Avenue of the Opera toward the Opera, taken from the Hotel Louvre as the end sheet of the book to conclude the book. That's Emma Willard, and that's the great cathedral at Rouen. When the Americans landed, they landed at Le Havre, and then they went overland by diligence, as they were called, a great, cumbersome, giant stagecoach that would carry 15 passengers, and they would stop overnight. It's about 110 miles, so halfway they would stop at Rouen. And they would there confront, there see, their first great European masterpiece. a building such as they had not ever seen in their lives nor imagined. Now, what was so important, first of all, was the scale. It was infinitely bigger than anything they'd ever seen in their lives. The tallest structure in the United States was the old Capitol in Washington, not the present dome, which was built at the time of the Civil War, but the old dome. And this was more than 300 feet higher. They had never seen a building made all of stone with exposed sculpture on the exterior of the building. But what was even more powerful for them was its age. Now, remember that we were a very young country. We've all known we're a young country, but consider how young we were then. A historic building would have been Independence Hall in Philadelphia, which in the 1830s wasn't even 100 years old. Here was a building that was begun before Columbus ever sailed. And Mary Cassatt, who was a very talkative, very eloquent person, she was the first American woman to champion higher education for women in America, the founder of the Emma Willard School, which is still in existence in Troy, New York. And she had come to Europe to better herself so she could be a better teacher. And she was speechless in front of that cathedral, and it wasn't until she sat down to write a letter that she poured out all these feelings that she had. And among them was how moved she was by this religious shrine. And she was a Protestant, and again, most of these people were Protestants. They are deeply moved by the great Catholic cathedrals of Europe. But the age got all of them. And Charles Sumner said he'd never before, until he stood in front of that magnificent work of architecture, he'd never felt before the prestige of age. This is the painting that Morse did. This is the interior of the Louvre. And Morse, at the same time he was in Paris painting this picture, got another idea for something called the telegraph. And he brought that idea back to America, perfected the telegraph, and then he went back to Paris to secure a patent for the telegraph. And while he was there, he met Daguerre, the inventor of photography, or the daguerreotype as it was called. And with Daguerre's permission, he then brought photography back to America. So that one man brought back this masterpiece, which, by the way, is going to be on exhibit at the National Gallery in Washington this summer. And if you happen to be in Washington, it's well worth going to see. Now, I haven't time to give you the details on this, but all the paintings were keyed so that they could know which masterpiece was which when it went on exhibit. But what he did not key were the people in the painting. Now, the people aren't just there to give the room scale. Everybody in there is playing a specific part. And as Morse had a famous Morse code for his telegraph, there is a kind of Morse code to the painting. But very quickly, because I don't want to give you all the answers to the mysteries today. Over here in the corner are James Fenimore Cooper and his wife and daughter, who is studying painting. She's at her easel, and there's very good reason to believe, and a lot of gossip at the time, that Morse was in love with her. Morse and his parents wanted nothing to do with it. This is Morse right here. He's instructing an unknown student, presumably French, in how to do a copy of this great painting on the left. And he's presenting himself not only downstage, front and center, and bigger in scale than anyone, as an instructor, as a painter, but as an instructor, a teacher. These people all were teachers in their ways, and when they all came back to teach. Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the most... all of these people who came back in part as teachers. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was the best known of all the medical students, came back to teach medicine, to teach anatomy at Harvard for more than 35 years. And the fact that Oliver Wendell Holmes was also a poet and an essayist and the founder of the Atlantic Monthly magazine was in no way considered by Holmes or anybody else as a contradiction or incongruous. It was all interesting. It was all possible. Here's this great painter, Morse, who's inventing the telegraph. These were people who were in the spirit of the 18th century still. The mind was something that could take on all kinds of things, and don't cut everything up into little categories the way we, alas, often do today. Over in here, at the entrance to the door is Horatio Greenough, the great sculptor. The man here painting was Morse's roommate, another American artist. This woman here is unidentified, but she's working on a miniature. She is presumably another French artist. One of the points he's making is that women are free to be artists, that the field of art is open to everybody. But as in all paintings, you have to consider not only what's in it, but what isn't in it. And what's so interesting is what he's left out. He's left out all the French bourgeois. He's left out any representation of French aristocrats. He's left out the soldiers of Paris, which were everywhere and came to the museum. Everybody came to the museum. And he's left out priests, Catholic priests. But again, that's a whole other part of the story that we have to move on and skip for the moment. This is George Healey. This was a self-portrait. When he didn't have a commission, he kept painting. He painted himself again and again. Stay in practice. Stay in shape. This is the painting by Healey that hangs in Faneuil Hall, the second or third most popular historic destination among Americans. Faneuil Hall in Boston. It's an enormous painting, bigger than the screen, bigger than could cover this whole wall. And this is George Healey, the Boston kid. This is his painting of Webster's reply to Hayne, one of the great moments in the history of the country, but in the history of the United States Congress. That's Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. on the left, the medical student, and that's the laboratory in which they dissected cadavers. And it's pretty gruesome stuff to read about, but as they said then, it was a lot better than practicing on a living arm or a living leg. And it wasn't possible to work with cadavers here, with very few exceptions, because cadavers were considered morally transgression to cut up somebody's body. The use of cadavers was outlawed in most states. Consequently, the only way physicians could get cadavers for dissecting purposes and education purposes was to buy them on the black market, but from grave robbers. And as a consequence of that, that meant they were very, very expensive. In Paris, there was no such stigma, and cadavers were plentiful, and every student who was there got to dissect every part of the human body many times over, which made them, as this man Holmes said, put them ahead of everyone at home. They could learn more in 2 years in Paris in the medical training there than it would take 10 years back home working as a general practitioner. This is Charles Sumner, a very handsome young man. Oliver Wendell Holmes stood 5'4", as he said good-naturedly, if wearing a pair of heavy boots. Charles Sumner stood a lanky 6'2". He had a magnificent voice. He was a very impressive fellow and made the most of all his abilities, and a brilliant intellectual thinker. And one of his great friends was another Bostonian, was Thomas Appleton, who was the one who famously said, when good Americans die, they go to Paris. This is George Catlin performing with his band of Iowa Indians, the painter George Catlin, before King Louis Philippe at the Palace of the Tuileries. One of the singular, most amazing moments ever to take place in the amazing city of Paris, because Catlin was greeted there as no American painter ever was, because the Parisians, in the aftermath of all that Rousseau had preached, were avid for anything about so-called unspoiled primitive man. That's Tom Thumb on the right, on the left, next to his patron, his master of ceremonies, P.T. Barnum. And Tom Thumb arrived just about the same time that George Catlin did, and the whole city was alive with Tom Thumb news and Tom Thumb appearances at the theater. One restaurant renamed itself Tom Pouce. And this is, on the right, that's Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose observations on the masterpieces in the Louvre were amazing, written by a woman who knew very little about art, but who would plunk herself down in front of one particular painting or another and sit there for an hour thinking about it, trying to understand it, and then go back and write about it. And she said, after she arrived in Paris, she said, I felt I had landed in dreamland.